and welcome to this webinar organized by the Bjerknes Center for Climate Research under the title of How Do We Value the Arctic? Today we promise some new insights and new perspectives on the ever-changing role of the Arctic. And with us we have a nice mix of different types of experts. And I'll introduce you to them now first. So the first one is Tor Elvik. He's a professor at the Geophysical Institute of University of Bergen, also with the Bjerknes Center of Climate Research. He's a climate scientist and an oceanographer by training, I think. The second one is Mette Stjerne Mauritzen. She's the head of research at the Institute of Marine Research, and her specialty is within ecosystems. The third one is Andreas Østhagen. He's a senior researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and a political scientist, I believe, Andreas. And the fourth one is Elana Wilson-Rowe. She's a research professor with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, also known as NUPI, and she's a political geographer. Happy to have you all on board. And perhaps climate scientists, especially, are blamed for being alarmists when it comes to future changes. But in any kind of scenario thinking, you typically have a worst case scenario, which can be beneficiary for anyone making decisions that take risk into account. Because so much is changing in the Arctic, it can perhaps be hard to predict or envisage what the worst case scenarios actually are. And of course, in a geopolitical context, the worst case scenario depends very much on your point of view. As a starting exercise and to kick this webinar off, I'd like to ask for the participants' viewpoints on such worst case scenarios, which I think is perhaps also something we can return to in the panel discussion. So Tor, given your background as a natural scientist, what is a worst case scenario for you?
Thank you, Eivind. Hello, everybody. I'm not sure I'm going to answer exactly the question you asked, but anyway, so well, I think for decades now, we've been used to the slogan, be worried, be very worried, which I think, for example, was on the cover of Time magazine. And this to me is maybe the biggest worry, because there's such an emphasis and expectation on how to say further worst case scenarios in the Arctic that I'm almost more worried if they don't play out. So what if we have the few more years of relative coldness or the ice don't retreat? I'm a little bit afraid what that will do to public perception and to the political will to stay on the commitment to actually doing something, because the climate system, as we know, is extremely inert. So the decisions we do today, we will first see the real difference in the climate, how to say, every day in some 30, 40 years. This is really when you will see the distinction between a Paris future and a business as normal future. So in a sense, this would be my worst case scenario.
Thank you. So the worst case scenario, if the worst case scenarios doesn't come true, that's also a worst case scenario.
No, but we know it's not unlikely that you will have the occasional year or even the occasional decade where you will see the opposite to what you would maybe expect.
All right, thank you for that. Mette, for life in the ocean, I guess, what is your perspective on the worst case scenario?
Yes, I think my worst case scenario would be a substantial loss of marine biodiversity, completely changing the marine ecosystems, and also changing or reducing the services provided to humans, such as food provisioning and also supporting our economies.
And does that worst case scenario seem like something which is very worst case? Is it far off from what we think will happen, do you think?
I'm not sure, because we kind of get opposite signals from the system. So if you look at the global modeling initiatives on marine ecosystems, They project, for instance, increased productivity and increased fisheries biomasses and so on for high latitude systems. And also at the Institute of Marine Research, we've done a climate vulnerability assessment of the key commercial stocks. And we've gone in detail through 37 stocks, and only 7 of them came out as very vulnerable to climate change, also when they take into future changes in temperature. And that was mostly North Sea stocks and only 1 stock in the Barents Sea, and that was a polar cod that is associated with the sea ice. But at the same time, we see that there is so much that we do not have an insight in, and especially what happens on lower trophic levels. Timing of events, we know the timing of the spring bloom and associated spawning and so on is so important for our high latitude systems. And if you can get disconnects in the system there if the timing changes. We have lots of critical habitats, of course, with sea ice melt. We have lots of species dependent on sea ice. We have species on the move that are changing and rewiring our ecosystems, and we don't know the consequence of that. And but maybe the most scary impact of all is the impact of heat waves, as we've seen in the Pacific and also in the Pacific Arctic. By the temperature increase far beyond what is expected over the next century, perhaps, but in a very short time. So while we are kind of preparing for this gradual increase in temperature, we have heat waves that blow off the scale. And in the Pacific side of the Arctic have had really profound impacts on the system, including also commercial species and massive die-off of seabirds and so on.
Great.
So that creates a lot of uncertainties in the projections.
It used to be like climate scientists were the worst ones in terms of predicting a horrible future. And now I think that sort of trophy has been passed to the biologist, but let's get back to that too. Andreas, with you and Elana, we're moving into the realm of people. What is your worst case scenario for the Arctic?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me and for giving me the chance to discuss this here on this seminar. I mean, I'm a political scientist dealing with international relations, so predictions aren't very easy to make. Fears, worst case scenario fears, however, are quite something different. I mean, if you really want to blow it up and say what's the worst case scenario when it comes to Arctic international relations, right? It is conflict between Arctic states. It's the fact that society could break down or states engage in war amongst each other, right? This is a worst case scenario. In such a scenario, then does it even matter really, whether the oceans are full of fish or whether climate change is happening, right? If you're actually engaging in life-threatening activity that might wipe out society, maybe a bit existential, but this scenario and this worst case scenario, of course, is rather unlikely. So, but you could take a version of this and scale it back a bit, right? And then again, in my area of research and focus, the worst case scenario is still some sort of conflict, some sort of worsening of relations amongst Arctic states, because that also impacts the states' abilities to agree on everything from dealing with ozone in the atmosphere to regional fisheries agreements, or even just the livelihoods and safety of people living close to the Russian border or Norwegian border, if you're say Norwegian or Russian or in other Arctic countries as well. So I mean, this is a constant worry, and we've seen now over the last decade, but even more so the last couple of years, this upwards or downward spiral, if you will, when it comes to rhetoric, when it comes to tension in the north. But there's a paradox here as well when it comes to the Arctic that I hope we can explore a bit later on. And this paradox is that although I think it's fair to say a lot of this tension that we see in the Arctic, geopolitical tension, it's not necessarily a consequence of climate change. It's not really the fact that you could ship from Kirkenes to Japan, or the fact that the fish stocks are moving, the fact that the ice is melting. This is not really what is driving the geopolitical tension. But the climate change effects in the Arctic are actually opening up for increased cooperation amongst the Arctic states, which again might actually hinder tension or might be a way out of increased tension. So that's something I think we can explore a bit later on, which is a paradox in this focus on climate and the Arctic.
I love a good paradox. Thank you, Andreas. Elana, a final catastrophic scenario. Can you make us even more worried than we are already by now?
I can try. Yep.
Yeah,
well, thanks again. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Knowing I was going last, I tried to think a bit differently. And I think the scenario that Andreas outlined really is one of the, there's very little expectation that there could be military conflict in the Arctic, but there's also this concern about vertical escalation from incidents, smaller issues in a more trafficked, a less dialogue-based Arctic, and where NATO-Russia tensions are high. Since I was going last, I tried to kind of take a different tack. What would be another worrying, maybe not worst case, but worrying outcome? And I kind of landed on this idea of an Arctic governance that moves too slowly, for example. And I think with that, it has the same background as the kind of concern for military conflict or incidents. And that's the idea that, okay, if there remains this large degree of tension in global politics, especially across the Russia-Europe, Russia-North America, Russia-NATO lines, that eventually, could that hinder progress on the governance, not necessarily problematize the governance we have today, but hinder progress on the governance that we are going to need as the Arctic continues to change, as new potential ocean industries arise that really are barely on the horizon today. So it's the question of, do we have this environment for creative, engaged, forward-thinking preparations for an open and trafficked Arctic, that it may also be pushed by technological developments in ways that we haven't really considered yet. Perhaps we don't pay enough attention to that leading edge of technology that is going to shape both ocean industries and the Arctic as well. So in that scenario, one could argue, okay, we have this good Arctic governance, but really all of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. There isn't the same appetite for kind of creative, progressive work on Arctic governance, and the governance we have is important, like the binding agreements on search and rescue, for example, or oil spill response, but they're not really the appetite for more than that. And I think in the same kind of slow Arctic kind of scenario, what you also see is that perhaps that maybe progress in the Arctic Council proceeds without difficulty, but really where kind of the proof is in the pudding, or where things actually happen, is that national governments need to implement and realize the spirit of some of those, everything from realizing the spirit of binding agreements all the way down to best practices. And even as early, I was looking back at some documents from the American chairmanship, which was 2015 to 2017. And even back then, the chair there noted that, we already have 234 declarations from the Arctic Council relating to oil and gas. Maybe we should slow down and implement some of them before we keep generating more. So kind of as part of this slow Arctic, that perhaps the Arctic states themselves, distracted by broader problems in global politics, maybe in national economic trouble themselves, don't implement the changes that would be necessary for Arctic governance. Some of what might be needed perhaps cost too much on other vectors. So that's my sort of the slow governance, kind of a slowly burning problem. And in this environment, that's also where I think we saw hints of it from the Trump, kind of during the Trump administration, where, in an environment where the slow work of diplomacy slowly building over time isn't happening, you have much more scope for grand gestures, like, well, let's secure ourselves by buying Greenland. Wouldn't that work? So that's my slow burning problem scenario.
Great, thanks. Too slow for a fast changing Arctic. I like that. That's a catchy headline. So what we'll do now is we'll move over to me asking some what we think is relevant questions to the different participants in this webinar, and they will answer those questions. And if someone in the audience, have additional questions or feel something that they want to comment on, the chat in the YouTube channel is open, and you can always post questions there, and we'll see after going through this list. First, I'll talk to Tor, then Mette, then Andreas, and then Elana, and then we'll move into a panel discussion at the end. So we'll try to save a little bit of time for that, and perhaps that's the best time for us to raise some of your questions if you have anyone. So then I'll move over to Tor, and we'll talk a little bit about predictability of climate change in the Arctic. And my first question is very simple in some sense, Tor. I mean, how important is it to understand the next, say, 20 years?
Yeah, so when you talk about climate predictability, I presume you mean to what extent we can foresee what fluctuates beyond this long-term trend towards a warmer and ice-free Arctic, yeah? Whether the next winter will be colder or this will be a mild decade and these things, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so this somewhat, or at least I choose to then continue a little bit along what I said initially. So if the horizon is the next 20 years, so building up to a Paris versus a business as usual future, that will be playing out on this horizon. So we better know what's going on to really distinguish. And then concerning actual climate prediction, to know whether the climatic conditions would be so and so in a 1 to 20 years perspective, of course, that would be extremely useful. There are, of course, many other things, such as the fisheries themselves, the interactions within the ecosystem and so on. But of course, the climatic conditions, the extent of sea ice and so on, how it fluctuates from one season to the next fishing season is tremendously important for fisheries. It's an insight that goes back to Halland Hansen and Nansen. And if you could even foresee how the actual fisheries would transgress national economic zones, for example, extremely useful. The more we go into renewables, well, what do we harvest renewables from? At least if you don't go into the Arctic proper, but think more about the subarctic, northern Norway, and so on. This is always also harvested from the ocean, the westerly winds. Yeah. So the structure intensity of that, the rain that falls over land, to what extent it fills the magazines of the hydropower stations. Hydropower is still the biggest renewable for Europe. And that fluctuates, the production there fluctuates with the winter rainfall over land. So yes, in a very practical sense, it's also very important. And I think this potential is largely untapped.
So talking about untapped potential, and I guess we can perhaps follow up with the question that would read something like, how well can we predict the next 20 years? Or if we speak sort of the tribal language lingo is, you know, what kind of skill do we have in terms of predicting change the next 20 years?
I can avoid going into the tribal language first and remain with the more predictable and more depressing part. So the climate system is slow or inert. So if we think about the Arctic, or at least the frozen parts of the planet, 1/3 of that is already in a local climate beyond freezing point. It just takes a long time for that ice to melt. So you know that will end up in the ocean with, let's say, the 20-year time horizon you had. So we already committed 1/3 of that. And then I'm not counting on Antarctica and Greenland in addition. Then on the more positive side, we are still exploring basic things such as the fluctuations of the Gulf Stream and its most northern branches, all the way up to it meets the ice edge and subducts. And that has interannual fluctuations that we can harvest on. If you can predict them further upstream, you can have a good guess whether the, for example, famous ice edge in the Barents Sea retreats or goes back. And then the guy that really can start to predict the winds predictably with a seasonal to multi-year time horizon, then you really struck the gold mine, both practically and economically. Because for those living over land, on land, of course, it's the wind that carries the marine climate to where we live.
All right.
And you have seen skill being increasing in latter years. And how to say, the benchmark to be skillful is that you beat flipping a coin, and that we do in certain things, such as the Ice Age, for example, 2 years into the future. But if you don't beat flipping a coin, then you remain in research mode.
Which is also okay.
So no, we prefer to be in a research mode.
So what makes predicting the climate of the Arctic difficult, and what kind of shortcomings should we have in mind?
Yeah, it's maybe not answering the question, or at least not what to expect. But I think one of the biggest hindrance we have, and I think our more political colleagues will kind of touch upon it as well. We have this insistence that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And from my point of view as a natural scientist, the most obvious thing is that the Arctic is influenced. What happens in the Arctic is mostly it happens elsewhere. It's more a prism. Global warming is more expressed in the Arctic than elsewhere. So first and foremost, what we need to understand what happens in the Arctic is how it's being influenced by what happens elsewhere. And when we have sorted out that part, we can go more into the nuances or how that feeds back on the larger scale, or even the rest of the planet. But I feel to a large extent now, because it's more exciting or whatever, we're kind of bypassing that part. And to me, I think that obscures getting predictability or just understanding properly what happens in the Arctic and the role of the Arctic in things. If I am to speculate as a political scientist, as I am not, for example, there's a big focus on like the Chinese Belt and Road politics, and they may or may not construct a railroad to Kirkenes through Finland and so on. And that's a massive investment for Norway. But I believe in the context of Belt and Road, it's just one of many things they can afford to invest and see what happens. So relative to China, I'm just asking to those who know better here. I'm not sure if they have a relatively big focus on the Arctic. They seem to have a focus most places. So sorry for digressing.
No, that's also a way of answering. So, I mean, you've given advice in terms of, for instance, sea ice, I believe, sea ice variability to politicians. And I think so. How well do you feel that perhaps the science behind predictions is understood and received by the public and the politicians then included to this?
Well, we have a little bit of a challenge, because we have two things that are extremely well understood. Weather forecasts. Everybody consults the weather forecast. So if there's one scientific practice, maybe except a few ones in medicine, this is the one that people know and use. Immediate time scale, here and now, and that they can assess the skill walking out the door. On the other extreme, there is what climate will be like, the projections 30 to 180 years into the future. And people, even though that is very complicated and in precision relatively unsure, although we know which way it's going, people are kind of used with that as well. And in this sense, climate prediction, let's say the weather forecast equivalent of climate, becomes hard to explain because it's somewhat immature. It's about the fluctuations around this long-term change people think they know will come anyway, and it's still also a topic in progress. We're not super skillful in many of the things we do. Many of the predictions are wrong. And most importantly, what we normally can do is some likelihood. And for the individual.
Thank you for those insights. I think we'll move over to Mette then. Move over to life in the ocean also. And if we just start off with the question, what which sectors, or maybe we should say industries, are sort of likely to expand in the Arctic? I mean, we heard a little bit about it already, but and what pressures can they add to the existing Arctic ecosystems, the way you see it, Mette?
Yes, well, we see that already that the fisheries are expanding polewards because the species that they are harvesting of are expanding northwards. So they are moving into more unfished areas with impacts that they have, of course, on that. But fisheries will mainly be constrained by the shelf. So we have the deep Arctic Ocean, and then we have shelf systems around, and the major fisheries will be limited by the shelf systems because that's the nutrient rich systems with high productivity. So those are the systems that will support big stocks that we harvest from. So it's not likely to develop a big fishery in the Arctic Ocean because it's so nutrient poor. Unless, of course, something really bad happens with the shelf systems, but we don't expect that. So in that sense, we don't really expect big fisheries in the Arctic Ocean. And in those areas, I guess that, so this is just speculation because the Arctic Ocean has been covered by sea ice. We have very little information about, for instance, what type of minerals are there, the petroleum reserves, what they are like. There is an expectation that in the northern Barents Sea, there is good resources of petroleum. So petroleum would like to expand, and that's the whole discussion with the vulnerable areas, the sea ice edge areas in the Barents Sea. That was last year in the cross-sector management plans that the petroleum industry would want to, and the petroleum sector would like the sea ice edge to be defined differently than other sectors. Because they want to expand further north in the Barents Sea. And in addition to that, I think maybe tourism is one of the key sectors, and of course also the transportation sector. So with less sea ice, there is the less sea ice is opening the northern sea routes, the Arctic sea routes between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And I was in a meeting with the coastal authorities a few days ago, and this, what I was told there was that we have always looked at these Arctic sea routes as sea routes going close to shores across the Arctic, but what we see, or what we expect now, or what they expected, was that when there is little sea ice, then the shipping business is trying to avoid going through different national economic zones to save money. So in that, and for the Barents Sea, it means that instead of entering the southern Barents Sea from the east, it enters from the north on the east side of Svalbard. So then go through very vulnerable areas that has not been exposed much to human activities before.
So if we move then on to how we actually manage this. So in your field, we typically talk about ecosystem-based management, which sounds very fancy. So, how can this way of thinking and acting aid in the way we sort of protect or even harvest our Arctic marine ecosystems?
Yes, so it's to me, ecosystem-based management is not very fancy. It's just hard work, and in a way, it's a kind of an ecosystem-aware decision-making, understanding that all the different sectors that are operating in an ecosystem are affecting the same system, and that the components of the systems are also interacting, so you get a lot of both direct and indirect effects. So a key to this ecosystem-based management is to overcome management in silos. So that we also, in addition to having management schemes for the different sectors, but that we also have a kind of a holistic, and to make sure that the impacts and benefits that are combined across all the sectors, that is evaluated and assessed, and ensure that the total impacts are within sustainable limits. I think that's the key to ecosystem-based management.
We want to overcome the silo thinking, I think. So there's a third question, and is because there has been introduced a moratorium to prevent unregulated fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. Do you think that can become a model for other resources in the Arctic? And what will it, if anything, require from the scientific community?
I'm not a policy expert, so I may not be the right person to answer this, but I have some viewpoints on it. And we have a research project now, which is called Barents Risk, where we have a stakeholder panel that with representatives from different sectors, all the key sectors in the Barents Sea. And when we ask them what kind of scientific support they need, and what are the key kind of elements and interactions in that system, also including humans, that is most important for them from their perspective, and try to let them point to priorities for our science, we see that there is very limited overlap in the perspectives of these different sectors. So what is important for one sector does not have to be important for the other sector, and actually they diverge more than they point in one direction, or to point to some key elements or some key interactions. So that's difficult and causes problems for us, because then it's more difficult for us to produce scientific products that can support a whole range of sectors, for instance, or the sector management bodies. And I think it tells us also that we don't have, it's not likely to have one solution that fits all. So when we have a moratorium for the fisheries, it may not be the same solution that fits the other sectors. And I think that there are some kind of background information that is useful to understand the successfulness of the fisheries moratorium. And one is that already when that moratorium was being discussed, there was also already then a kind of a common understanding or expectation that the Arctic Ocean will not be important for fisheries, because it's a nutrient poor system. And another thing is that there was also a history of overharvesting in areas beyond national jurisdictions before the moratorium in the Pacific, so or in the Bering Sea, which made 2,000 scientists sign up for this moratorium for the Arctic. So that is also some background or part of the fisheries story that probably like motivated this moratorium. And in addition to that, we also have a long history of international agreement in fisheries. So there's a lot of tradition there to build on. And maybe a final aspect of this is that it's easier to make these agreements before the sectors are moving into this area than after. And we have actually a similar regulation implemented now also in the northern Barents Sea. And that is a response to climate change and to the reduction of sea ice, where our Ministries of Environment and Fisheries, they observed that fisheries and the demersal trawling fisheries were moving northwards when the sea ice declined and moving into previously unfished areas. So they initiated a project where we looked into vulnerable habitats and created some regions where it's now not allowed to fish with bottom trawl before the fisheries are entering those regions.
Perfect. So regulations are possible. So that's encouraging, I guess, to some extent. I think this also builds very well over to the next speaker, which is Andreas. And I'm sure there's a lot of things here for you to comment on. Maybe we'll get back to that even during the discussions, to the panel discussion. But first of all, let's start with this Arctic Ocean space. What makes it so hard to manage, if that's true then, compared to, for instance, land areas?
Well, many different things, but I'll try to stick with what was in my realm of expertise, the political ones, because I guess we could definitely talk about the geographic aspects of the Arctic Ocean, the climatic aspects, right? Whether it's the vastness of it, the ice, the harshness in climate in general, or just the fact that it's undergoing rapid changes, probably fluctuating more than most other maritime domains on the planet. But this is not my field of expertise, and I think the two previous speakers, Tor and Mette, knows much more than I do on those changes that are occurring there. But what I'm interested in would then be the political dynamics or political challenges that follow from these rapid changes taking place in the Arctic. And as I touched upon in the beginning when we talked about worst case scenarios, right? On the one hand, you've seen increased tension, especially over the last couple of years, especially since 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea. You've seen increased tension between NATO and Russia. A lot of it taking place in say, our part of the Arctic, the Barents Sea or the North Atlantic. But this is arguably, as I also said in the beginning, limited in terms of how it's linked to those rapid changes. And this is not necessarily something that is unique to the Arctic, right? You see this in other parts of the world as well. So if you disregard the overarching geopolitical tensions, if you will, and you focus on instead, which aspects of the Arctic maritime domain or the different maritime domains, right? Because the Arctic Ocean is actually, right, many different maritime domains. Are there certain things that are unique to the Arctic when it comes to challenges, that it comes to hard to manage, as you mentioned, Øyvind? And here you see fisheries in particular standing out, and Mette talked about this as well. Not only the fact that the fish stocks themselves are impacted by climate change, and perhaps more so in the Arctic or close by Arctic waters than other parts of the world, but also the fact that the countries that are in the Arctic and that surrounds the Arctic Ocean and the different maritime domains, these countries are largely dependent on fisheries. They have large fishing industries. They have large communities that used to be, at least traditionally, historically, dependent on these fish stocks, these same fish stocks that are now changing their patterns or distribution. So this causes a political problem, right? Because the governance structures that Alana also highlighted in her initial comments, right? The governance structures that are set up or were set up, it could be a decade ago, it could be half a century ago, to manage these fish stocks. These governance structures aren't necessarily adapting fast enough. They're not changing rapidly enough. We've seen this, for example, with the mackerel in the North Atlantic, right? And how there's been limited abilities for the coastal states to agree on a total distribution of the quotas or a change in the distribution of the quotas. We haven't seen this as much in the Barents Sea between Norway and Russia that are co-managing the cod stock and other fish stocks as well. We haven't really seen problems emerge yet. There might be problems in the future, right? If the fish stock, especially the cod, were to change its distribution even more, or the total allowable catch would be reduced. You know, there are fears that this might cause tension. We've seen the snow crab wander in from the east into Norwegian waters or waters around Svalbard, which has caused a whole different story with the EU. So you've definitely seen it when it comes to fisheries, right? And the impact of the nexus between climate change, the impact of climate change on the maritime domains, and how the surrounding states have been able or not been able to deal with this. And this is say, more difficult than on land, at least. And then you have the high seas in the middle of it all. And not every maritime domain in the world, not every part that states have to agree on how to manage has this high seas donut hole. And Mette talked about this as well, and perhaps we could debate this further. But in many ways, this agreement, and even you said that as well, this agreement between the 5 coastal states and then 5 external actors, the 5+5 moratorium on fisheries activity in the high Arctic Ocean, is a very good example, right? A success story of how to deal with something before a problem emerges. And I like the question you had, even also to Mette, you know, could this be used on other types of resources? Because there is a fear that as soon as a resource becomes politicized, as soon as you have actors that are actually utilizing this resource, like with this, even with the snow crab, right? The snow crab wandering in, and just a few EU vessels starting to harvest the snow crab, but that suddenly started a snowball effect of say limited governance or governance failures. So, is it a right answer to you know, could this be used elsewhere? The question you asked Mette as well, it's difficult, but it's at least a very relevant question to ask, and a very important one as well. And I think I'll leave it at that. I could talk for a long time about the challenges at sea, but I guess you have more questions for me, Øyvind.
I do have more questions for you, but thank you for sort of highlighting the point of the Arctic having sort of this mobility of resources, which sort of poses particular challenges, I guess. But talking about resources and species on the move, do you think we're entering a period of increased conflicts over these resources, or is that just the hype?
Well, this hype was why I got into Arctic studies in the first place, where Alana was already an established expert, and I was coming into this field a decade ago and trying to pick apart that argument, right? The resource conflict argument that was really prevalent in 2008, 2009, 2010, that the Arctic states or even external Arctic actors of states would inevitably end up in a conflict over Arctic resources. And initially the focus was on oil and gas, but then research produced by Alana and others have shown, right, that no, actually the dynamics within the Arctic region amongst the Arctic countries over, in particular, oil and gas, but also other things like shipping, like minerals, it's not actually leading to conflict. I mean, the Arctic states are struggling to even develop, to produce the oil and gas that they know is in the Arctic, right? Because of various reasons, whether it's infrastructure or distance from markets or low prices worldwide and a turn towards greener energy. The same goes for minerals, and shipping is a different story, but again, hasn't led to conflict. So that's the kind of initial background. But then your question, I guess, entails, given the focus on fisheries that I also highlighted, given the marine living resource focus, and the fact that we've seen the most change when it comes to this in the Arctic, or there's been the most political change as well when it comes to how to distribute these resources and emerging conflicts over it. Will we inevitably see a conflict over these resources? And it's easy to answer yes, right? Because it's easy to equate a changing climate and limited or inflexible governance regimes, and then just say, oh, of course, this naturally must lead to more conflict. But I don't really believe in those simple causal mechanisms. I think we see that the states, although they engage in, they call it limited disputes, whether it's the snow crab or the mackerel, or sometimes not agreeing on the cod quota, these disputes tend to be compartmentalized. The countries aren't that interested in them damaging wider relations, neither between Norway and the EU. There's no fish war between Norway and the EU right now, even though Latvian and Lithuanian fishers can't catch snow crab, right? And the same goes with Iceland and mackerel. We don't have a mackerel feud with Iceland at the moment. So although you have these examples, the historic examples that we love to use, like the Turbot War in the 90s with Canada and Spain, and the Cod Wars between the UK and Iceland in the 70s, 60s, I don't really see this escalating that much. That doesn't mean that it's not a problem and that we shouldn't deal with it, and you know, that they could actually cause disruption for a lot of people, especially communities and companies. But that's something different from saying, oh my God, we will have an outright conflict over resources in the Arctic.
Excellent. Not paying attention to the tension is probably what leads to a conflict at some level. But so one more quick question then, Andreas, because, you know, one way to safeguard the Arctic is perhaps through this mechanism known as a marine protected areas, or similar to national parks we have on land. Do you think this is a viable way forward, or is it? Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid here that I might get the natural scientists on my back, or climate scientists, because I don't know how much MPAs are doing what, you know, with examples from around the world, how much they're doing what you want them to do in terms of protecting species, and how much they help the larger cause of protecting, you know, our oceans. I can't speak to that point, but what I can speak to is kind of a divergence in how different actors, different states are using MPAs for political advantage, and how it seems that in Norway, especially, we have a rather call it restrained approach to using marine protected areas, right? This is not something that the Norwegian government is pushing. That doesn't mean that the Norwegian government does not want to protect the oceans, right? Norway is engaging heavily through the UN and various other mechanisms to be part of solving the ocean problems that are all on the agenda right now. But Norway has been reluctant to just say a blank, or to put in place a blanket ban on resources within certain maritime domains. Let's rather use research. Let's rather figure out, right? Let's regulate this, as Mette also talked about, ecosystem approach based management, instead of this just outright ban. But here we see a contrast with especially the North American Arctic states, Canada and the US, where it seems to be that the political culture, perhaps, maybe that's the reason why I need to study this in depth, I think, to explain why these countries take this approach. But at least you see it in the Arctic. You see that the US, very much dependent on who's in office, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, either take a open for economic activity approach, or let's just ban oil and gas drilling offshore. Let's ban fisheries in certain parts. And you see the same approach taken in Canada. And we have examples, right? Canada and the US agreeing with Trudeau and Obama when he was president, agreeing on a moratorium for fisheries in certain parts of the Beaufort Sea, right? An approach that is perhaps unthinkable that Russia and Norway would take in the Barents Sea. Right, they would prefer different means, and you can actually contrast, or but you can compare this to what is happening on the other pole, Antarctic, right, where again you see that certain actors, especially the EU, led by Germany, France, the UK, now not EU anymore, but still pushing MPAs in a way also to achieve global targets, Aichi targets, right? To block off certain parts of the globe, and Antarctica has become a focal point for a lot of this attention, whereas Norway has taken a different approach, in a way actually been accused of colluding with China and Russia, and wanting to instead just open up for economic activity, whereas the Norwegian government says no, we're not pushing for economic activity in the same way that perhaps China and Russia has been in Antarctic, but we're taking a middle approach. We want a different approach to how we implement these outright bans of activity. So again highlighting and nuances, and also highlighting that, especially in the case of Antarctica, and especially in the case of the EU, a lot of this push to put in place MPAs there is so that you don't have to put in place MPAs where you live, right? There's not in my backyard. No MPA in the Mediterranean, no MPA in the Black Sea, no, the Baltic Sea or the North Sea, but Antarctica, that's great. So am I answering your question? I can't speak to how the MPAs are solving ocean problems, and perhaps they indeed are. And we have the ongoing international negotiations on the BBNJ, and creating proper frameworks to do this. And they sound to me at least as viable ways forward. But I can only note that there are also different opinions on how to go about this. So I don't think it's a quick fix for everything.
Thanks, Andreas. I think you answered very well on that question. And although I feel like Mette would perhaps like to comment on this, I think we'll have to wait for the panel discussion before we do that. So, Elana, what would you say? Is there anything special about Arctic governance, or is it like environmental or regional governance, elsewhere in the world?
Oh, thank you for the good first question. Also, really enjoyed the previous papers. I would say I want to share a slide with you. So many of us haven't traveled much lately, so we're going to take a quick trip through a satellite picture to a different part of the Arctic. Also gives me a quick opportunity to say hello from the Lorax project, which is funding my research on the Arctic today. But here, so now you can see the satellite question, and I hope to link it to the question that you asked about, is the Arctic separate or different? And this ties also into what Tor was saying in his presentation about kind of this frustration between an Arctic and a global framing. And I think we have that same tension in political framings as well. But so I'll start by taking us on that quick trip. And what you see in the upper corner of the slide is a view looking down at Big and Little Diomede Islands, which are between the Alaskan, the United States mainland, and Siberia or Russia on the other side. And for centuries, this part of the Bering Sea was basically crisscrossed by kinship ties, trade, visiting for fun amongst the people who lived on both coasts. And even very entwined up until about the end of the mid 1940s, when the Cold War really began or intensified, and you had in this area that it became separated by the ice curtain, with Big Diomede Island being in the Soviet Union and Little Diomede Island being part of the US. So this ice curtain made contact impossible. But it was also here in the 1980s with the first kind of thaw of glasnost that some of the earliest regional people-to-people ties were resumed. And I wanted to open with this brief little story for two reasons, both because sometimes as we move into this geostrategic or governance view of the region, that often people fall a bit out of focus. The fact that, there are all kinds of people living in different ways in the Arctic, and also because I think it reminds us of how place matters, that Arctic interconnections, that could be the ecosystems themselves, the indigenous peoples, longstanding cross-border economic activities, and also the science networks that have been established and developed for over 100 years are a resource for Arctic governance and for circumpolar cooperation and mobility. And when we think about it this way, we don't have to decide if the Arctic is completely special or exceptional, but it allows us rather to just say that, of course, like any place in the world, there is a specific history. This happens in a specific place, and that brings certain kinds of resources to politics. So not all places are the same, even if they are kind of buffeted by more global trends and dynamics. And I think the reason I like to draw attention to these Arctic specificities is also because we see they really matter in politics. When we have political actors talking about why can they cooperate in the Arctic and not elsewhere, it is often these same kind of interconnections that are brought into view, so that we see in practice it really is a resource for thinking a bit differently about Arctic governance than perhaps relations seen simply as US-Russia relations, for example, would allow for in a broader sense. So, and I think it's important that we will not fall into the trap of, is the Arctic separate or completely different or exceptional in a political sense, to realize that there are very specific resources that can be brought to play. And you also see the other map there is a map of the indigenous language groups in the Arctic, which is actually currently being updated. So everyone has an opportunity to provide input in kind of a community mapping effort now.
Thanks. So in some sense, I think maybe Andreas also answered the question of, what are the main challenges regarding sort of continued cooperation and stability in the Arctic. But maybe that question also sort of borders into the question of, is Arctic governance fit to meet and manage the future challenges?
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate on that maybe?
Absolutely. I think, we've heard from the other speakers about the transforming physical environment. We've heard the point, which I think is very important, that, our kind of a classical geopolitical perspective would say, changing landscape, something to be acquired resources would only lead to conflict. But really what the last decade has shown is actually the kind of the dramatic year of the Arctic sea ice low in 2007 actually triggered a remarkably cooperative period in Arctic politics. And I think it's important to keep in mind that, the interests, the political and economic interests of the Arctic states are very well served by a stable environment. Conflict is costly, conflict is disruptive to other forms of interest, for example, economic or other forms of politics. So that it really precipitated, rather than conflict, kind of actually a new chapter in Arctic governance construction with these binding agreements. Then you also have, we've talked a bit, maybe not so much about NATO, Russia, security tensions, which are absolutely, I think, are more acute than they have been at a period in earlier times. But at the same time, if we look back at time, occasionally I'm surprised looking back. In one of Andreas's article, he wrote about the electron conflict, and that is like a limited dispute, but at the same time, a quite dramatic moment. So I also think it's important to realize that what we have of Arctic governance today wasn't developed in some sort of utopian past, that we've had the NATO-Russia rivalry all along. It's been perhaps more dormant at certain periods than others, but certainly never resolved. So it's that kind of, I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And I think it's also important for how we look at political science, because we tend to kind of have often two separate communities, one that studies diplomacy and the other that may look at security politics. Whereas what we see in the Arctic is really that these kinds of dynamics of cooperation and also rivalry have been mixed. So I like to point out kind of the frenemy politics of the Arctic have been there for a long time. And yet there has been in the same period, the development of some really important governance, cooperative governance mechanisms. And then kind of the last risk before I turn to this question of, fitness for future challenges of Arctic governance, I think ties into the fact that politics and governance has definitely expanded. Certainly, if we go back to 20, 30 years, you see it still was a quite complex picture. We've had community level groups, indigenous peoples representation and organizations have been hugely important to developing the Arctic. But what you certainly saw is this uptick in global interest. But I also do agree, I think Tor brought it up also in his presentation, that perhaps sometimes I think China's interest in the Arctic is exaggerated or not really seen as part of their broader foreign policy or security policy that makes you realize it's not as specific to the Arctic as one might think. And also the point that relating to both the topic covered by both Mette and Andreas, that we actually have had an interesting innovation in Arctic practices or governance practice with the fisheries moratorium, a way for Arctic states to lead, but also substantively involve states that have a significant interest in that particular field. So I thought that was a very interesting discussion for me to hear. But if it kind of turning to your actual question of up for the challenge, I guess I would say mostly yes. I think that there has been this robust framework of governance. It has been developed also within and withstood broader tensions and problems in global politics. It's important to note that the changing physical nature has also triggered leadership, not just geopolitical rivalry. But at the same time, and perhaps if we talk a bit about the Russian Arctic Council chairmanship, we can go into more detail, that there is a kind of, I think, especially today in this more difficult global environment for global politics, there is this emphasis on status quo maintenance. And I think that it's important. It's important not to lose areas of cooperation or governance that really aren't addressed anywhere else in the world than the Arctic Council. But at the same, that kind of diplomatic work needs encouragement and it needs resources. But at the same time, there is a risk that it might be too static. And I think that given the changes the Arctic will undergo, that this ties a bit back perhaps to my worst case scenario about governance work proceeding too slowly or perhaps too conservatively for the challenges that are coming up.
Thanks. I mean, you mentioned it briefly, but I guess this is a question that for some reason is on many's lips, I guess, for those who are interested in the Arctic. And the question is typically posed very differently from when the Swedes took over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, or when Iceland took over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. So you know, now the Russians are taking over the chairmanship, and there seems to be a lot of, I don't know, questions, you know, what to expect from this. Do you have any ideas or feelings about this question? Or
I think I like the way you asked the question, because I think it's of course reflective of where we are in politics today, that it is such a big question that switching, I mean, everyone, kind of the Arctic nerds, are always very interested in like what will be the new chairmanship priorities, when really what we see from chairmanship to chairmanship is that the differences are often not huge. Usually the host countries will have maybe a couple kind of flagship projects or status projects or something that they find especially interesting or want to try to set the agenda with. But really the core of the Arctic Council's work, especially in the working group level, doesn't seem to change all that much. But it is interesting to note, I mean, there are some interesting nuances and things that I'll be following with interest. I think that what you see primarily are pretty familiar topics proposed for the Russia chairmanship or talked about. You also saw at the last, at the conclusion of the Icelandic ministerial, this launch of a strategic plan, which kind of outlines areas of agreement, that how will the countries try to work, what will be the main areas of work over the next decade. Also includes primarily pretty familiar topics, but perhaps the interesting is the political commitment to agreeing to have such a strategic plan is a sign, I think, of a hope to send a cooperative signal. But I do think in the chairmanship itself, what I'll be following with interest is that always all of these, you know, the Arctic Council focuses a lot on questions of sustainable development. And that's actually a very loaded and tricky topic and theme. I think Andreas' examples of, for example, the US-Canada cooperation on protecting areas or taking certain areas out of running for oil and gas development also illustrates this, that there's a kind of a tension between a conservation and use dynamic that you've seen through all the debates of the Arctic Council over time. It kind of divides itself sometimes along country lines. It also can divide itself along internal domestic lines. Like the moratorium that Andreas mentioned was, you know, kind of wildly seen as, it was a kind of popular news splash for a lot of places in the US that were concerned about climate, concerned about the Arctic environment, but was really received by a lot of both Alaskan and Northern Canadian communities and provinces and territories as kind of a betrayal of their right to work out the contours of their economic development at a more local level. So I think that dynamic it's always been tricky and it will remain tricky. I think it will be interesting to see to what extent the Arctic Council really does follow this growing wave of attention and expectations about how much the oceans are meant to provide in terms of economic value, this whole kind of blue economy wave, which I think it points out some interesting areas. It also has some very problematic sides. I think it'll be interesting to see how that topic gets woven into Arctic cooperation and Arctic Ocean debates. I think also if we think of how important Arctic resources are for Russia's national economy, this question of, as we enter an age of decarbonization, which is happening inevitably, what will be these kind of major profit driving sectors that could eventually replace the profits from oil and gas. And I think finally, the last reason why I think that we see a lot of attention towards the Russian chairmanship is that it also simply opens up a lot of interesting scope for kind of margin diplomacy. And I think we saw that already in Iceland with meetings between the US and Russia on the margins. So I think the simple fact of the Russian chairmanship will kind of create a renewed attention to how will this kind of Russia/NATO, Europe, North America relations be managed. It creates this sort of interesting side form. So that's certainly something I'll be following with a great deal of interest.
Thank you so much, Ilona. And so with that, I think we'll try to ease over into something which is a panel discussion. It's not so easy to run a panel discussion on this platform, but we'll give it a go. And since one of those questions that came up in the chat earlier sort of overlaps with one of my questions, I'll just think I'll post that question first, and whoever who sort of feels called to answer this question, just raise your hand or take the word. So the headline for this webinar is, how do we value the Arctic? And I guess central to that question is another question, who are we when we talk about the Arctic? Not represented in this webinar is, for instance, indigenous people who perhaps value the Arctic for different reasons, though not necessarily than perhaps we do. Do you consider this still to be a relevant dilemma for the Arctic? And could perhaps researchers be better at including local knowledge and people in their scientific endeavors? Do we have any takers on this? Mette, did you raise your hand or?
No, I didn't raise my hand because I have not worked specifically on indigenous knowledge, but we have initiatives around the Arctic, trying to establish frameworks for integrated ecosystem assessments, we call it. So that's where we try to have this overview of major drivers and pressures and impacts, and also look into trade-offs between benefits and impacts, and of course in that respect indigenous knowledge and also indigenous perspectives are extremely important, and also it's also kind of two different knowledge systems. So we have the more traditional scientific based knowledge systems that goes into these integrated ecosystem assessments, but we also try to find ways to include indigenous knowledge that actually have, often long-term observations that can be used to assess change in these Arctic systems, and also they have a lot of knowledge on mechanisms and processes.
Thanks. So now everyone wants to comment. So Tor, maybe you were first, I guess.
Yeah, so of course I'm extremely ignorant on the indigenous perspective and so on, but I think we need to appreciate, and it has to be appreciated, that those directly affected by things here and elsewhere when it comes to environmental change or political governance, whatever, needs to be taken more into the process, at least in a country such as Norway, and I believe for most countries around the Arctic. But if I can get a little bit closer to home to the who are we, I think the Norwegian context is quite interesting, because we're a little bit schizophrenic to the whole thing, because the Arctic or the North or the exploration of all these things is extremely, how to say, in the genes of the nation, of all of Norway. So all of Norway kind of feel it belongs to, or have an ownership to the Arctic in one sense. So that is partly the big interest in Norway. At the same time, but it's not really clear to me when it happens, it's also an extremely local thing. Who gets to define the Arctic issues, who gets to deal with them, and so on. And this is something I'm only on the tangent at, being a climate scientist, but I even tend to see it in the processes I am, if you see what I'm getting at. So this I find it extremely interesting in a Norwegian context.
Elana?
I just want to briefly say, I think it's important that indigenous communities and their organizations have been a huge part of how Arctic politics has developed and why it's developed, and certainly are part of one of the early drivers for a more regional approach to the Arctic. And you also see that repeatedly during periods of geopolitical difficulty, for example, in the Canadian Arctic Council Ministerial, the first one that was held after the annexation of Crimea, that you saw the indigenous people's representation, the permanent participants stood up and repeatedly called for a focus on issues local to the Arctic, paying attention to the community challenges rather than necessarily letting the cooperation perhaps be too shaped by broader geopolitical pressures. And I recommend to anyone to watch the recent streaming of the Icelandic ministerial, and it was really interesting to watch the interventions of the permanent participants there. One of the things that really struck me was one speech from the Arctic Athabascan Council that called for a need for the indigenous peoples organizations need to have a real agenda setting capacity. I think there's some concern that as the Arctic has become much more of a national priority for a lot of countries, that perhaps some of the space for true engagement has closed down a bit in the Arctic Council, that it's become maybe more high politics, bigger diplomatic teams, and so on, all of which bring more resources, but actually may drown out some of the fact that it's actually meant to be an organization or a forum where there are multiple sources of agenda setting, not just driven by national interests. And also, secondly, I thought the intervention of the Christine Henriksen from the Sami Council was very good, where she also hinted at some of the problems of what one might call kind of green colonialism, where even though the Arctic environment is changing rapidly, that it's not necessarily the land or sea areas that are already in use for other purposes that might best lend themselves to solving the challenges of finding enough opportunities for green energy. So I think there's a second concern there about how mitigating climate change could also become such a dominant discourse that it washes away other important commitments, for example, to other forms of land use, that it's such a driving problem that it might wash out some other political commitments.
I saw your hand up earlier, Andreas, but you took it down. Or did you want to comment this? Or
Yeah, I do. I don't have that much to add. I very much agree with, of course, including the indigenous perspective, which I think Alana highlighted as well, that the Arctic is in many ways not doing it perhaps well enough, but perhaps better than some other parts of the world, or at least has a track record that shows that it has tried to, or the Arctic states have tried to. But it also includes the local perspective, right? Not all people living in the Arctic are indigenous as well. I'm from the Arctic, the Norwegian Arctic. Not that really says much in a Norwegian context, because I think it's also Tor highlighted, right? You can drive from Oslo to the Norwegian Arctic in a day, and that's something very different than Greenland or Canada, the Canadian Arctic, or Alaska and an American Arctic, right? So I think it's important also to highlight the variation across the Arctic if we're talking about local inclusion, local governance, the issues the different Arctic countries are facing. A community in the Canadian Arctic is facing something very different than a community in the Norwegian Arctic. But when it comes to local inclusion, local and indigenous inclusion, and just highlighting an example from the security domain or international relations domain that is highly relevant right now, has been a debate in Norway on allowing American nuclear submarines to dock just outside of Tromsø. And this is a typical, government of Norway, Ministry of Defense decision taken in Oslo, or maybe even taken in Brussels at NATO headquarters, right, or in Washington, D.C., or wherever you might find different armed forces in the U.S. But the typical decision that definitely during the Cold War wasn't really taken with the consent of the local population. Whereas what we've seen now, I think, over the last couple of years, with this case in Tromsø as an example, the Thule air base in Greenland is another example, is kind of local and indigenous participation also when it comes to these large geopolitical issues, actually questioning why are we opening this space here? What might be the environmental and health impacts of it, and how does it make us safe as a local community? And I'm not saying, and I think many would not agree, that the Tromsø case of submarines has been an example of good inclusion. Many would argue that no, actually not, hasn't been good enough, but at least that we're having a debate about it shows perhaps that we're moving in the right direction.
Thanks. With respect to sort of Arctic politics, governance, Norway is sometimes portrayed as more important than our size tends to indicate. I mean, we're a very small country after all. Do you think there is any truth to this, like in terms of boosting our national egos, and is there any good examples of this? Elana, would you like to comment on that first? Or?
Sure. I think that's a wonderful question, and I do think that in that in the Arctic, Norway has often perhaps, maybe Norway is not that small, kind of in a compared to Russia, yes, but as an actor with major economic interests in the Arctic, I think Norway has often been very, very leaned in and led in some areas. Seen from other countries, I think the fact that Norway maintains these kind of pragmatic areas of cooperation with Russia on like pollution or fisheries is seen as a very important and relevant experience that other countries tend to be, to a certain degree interested in hearing about or taking as examples for practices that could, for example, be established in the Bering Sea. I think also for Norway, so of course, Norway doesn't have endless options. That Norway has a very long-standing alliance politics with NATO and the EU that are extremely important to Norwegian foreign and security politics and policy. But I think to a large degree that Norway has successfully, through a variety of measures, been a rather important voice within these organizations for how Arctic and security challenges are viewed, perhaps not in every single instance, but we've seen cumulatively over time. And if I were to choose one area where, given that Norway has, as a small state, is very interested in the multilateral system, using it as a very strong diplomatic core, that I would like to see more active Arctic diplomacy on Arctic policy issues in other settings outside the Arctic Council, relating, to plastics, climate, to perhaps ocean governance and science. Because I actually think that this would be an important way of really engaging with and capitalizing on the significant interest that the Arctic enjoys also from non-Arctic states to really push for some real progress on maybe black carbon, plastic mitigation, the big costly science that the ocean decade has pointed to, and so on. So that's where, if I were to say, where would I like to see Norway putting down even more effort, it would be in that broader field of multilateralism, Arctic politics outside the Arctic too, to a greater degree.
I have Andreas and then afterwards Tor.
Yeah, I mean, as a Norwegian from the Norwegian Arctic, right? Of course, I think that our role cannot be big enough in the Arctic. No, but I do think, and Alana, she highlighted the good points as always. So I just think also that the fact that we have 500,000 people living in our Arctic, if you define the Arctic as north of the Arctic Circle, north of Saltfjellet, not that again that really says much, right? If you're just from the south of the circle, it's more or less the same community as you're from the north, but still, being that's the political definition, and 500,000 people living up there, all the resources, not natural resources, but resources in terms of competence in Bodø and Tromsø and Alta and Hammerfest, etc., and all the technology and the researchers, scientists, this also gives Norway clout compared to, for example, Canada, right, with 110,000 people spread across a size of Western Europe, and that mostly the Arctic resources, not mostly, but a lot of the Arctic resource capacity in Canada are not located in the Arctic, whereas in Norway the picture is a bit different. So I think that gives Norway also a reasonable advantage or a reasonable size. Also the fact that our oceans in the Arctic are not covered by ice predominantly, right? So we have much more economic activity, much more fishery as well, or other types of activity. And I agree with Alana. Norway could probably even use it even more, maybe even upplaying what Alana highlighted as one of the strengths, the collaboration with Russia. Perhaps Norway could take even a stronger role internationally, multilaterally in NATO, trying to highlight what Alana said before as well, this frenemy concept, right? That you don't have to, there's not one track vis-a-vis Russia. You're not either in conflict or you're best friends. You could do both at the same time. And perhaps Norway hasn't really done or used all of its potential there. So yeah, I think Norway has a big role to play. I think though, now living in Oslo, having lived abroad as well, it is still surprisingly many Norwegians who don't care about the Arctic, who don't know about the Arctic or the high north government policy. And the state media, NRK, they're not the first ones to write about the high north. They're the first ones to write about the US election or whether some governor in New York has done something, right? News that are often irrelevant to a Norwegian audience. Same with, the coverage of conflicts happening in the Middle East and elsewhere. Whereas focus on Russia, collaboration in the north, the relationship in the north, high north policy in general, tends to be a bit more subdued. So I don't think all of Norway necessarily kind of goes into this high north euphoria that I guess we share as Arctic scientists.
Let's hope we're educating some of those people who are not that interested in the Arctic today then. Tor?
Yeah, Andreas already touched by it, and Mette can probably dig deeper into it, but we shouldn't forget about the Barents Sea. Although it's not very polar, it's in the Arctic, and it's a major food chamber irrespective of where it's placed. And it's been the backbone for European trade going from the far north to south for hundreds of years. So there are quite some things that are just prominent objectively here.
Thanks. I was actually going to ask you, Matt, I think some of those areas that maybe not particularly what Elana was going for, but do you envisage that the Russians, and Norway IMR have an excellent collaboration with Pinro in Russia and have so for many years? Is there a scenario here that IMR and Pinro is starting digging out sort of MPAs that we can push forward?
That is a good question. As Andreas already mentioned, that the MPAs is maybe not the solution that is on top of the list for Norwegian management, and we have a very recent government white paper actually on conservation of marine biodiversity, pointing to absolutely establishing more MPAs. They are kind of behind the process that was, I think it was carried out in 2004, if I remember correctly. So they are working on establishing more MPAs, but also very important to our government is to look into these OECMs. It's called other effective area-based conservation. Other effective area-based management effort or measures, it's called. Sorry, I always forget what it stands for. But that is to look more to what kind of sector-specific regulations give protection to marine biodiversity, and to include that in the kind of the overall assessment of protection of marine biodiversity. For instance, like the non-trawling areas in the northern Barents Sea that I was talking about. So those types of measures will be very important. And I would like to comment also on the discussion on marine protection areas, because it is a difficult debate also scientifically. It has been challenging to see the outcome of these MPAs, and also they include a lot of different types of human activities, even though they are registered as MPAs, including the Norwegian ones. And also with the climate change impact and species on the moves, then it may not be very likely that the MPAs that has been put in place historically, that they will be equally efficient in a future climate, because the species are moving. So now the scientific community are trying to develop maybe new types of MPAs, more dynamic MPAs that can track the changes of the systems, or networks of MPAs that also can buffer from impacts while the systems are changing and species are moving. So it's not I don't think it's a simple solution. It's not only to put out MPAs and then you have kind of solved the problem. But if I can just mention one point more, and that is this understanding of cumulative impacts in a climate change adaptation perspective is incredibly important, because the Arctic systems is kind of it's going through a kind of a double whammy, because as climate is changing, sea ice is disappearing, and more human activities are coming in. And I think we get a better and better understanding of that. That reducing anthropogenic stress to this system is an important climate change adaptation, and that is how we can build resilience of these ecosystems to the climate change. So it's really important to have these cumulative impact perspectives also in the climate change adaptation discussions.
Thanks. You know, we're edging towards the end of this webinar, sadly, because I'd like to keep you on here and keep on discussing, but and I do like to end on a, let's say, at least a moderately optimistic tone. So I'm thinking sort of back, for me at least, I think there was a significant turning point back in 2007, and we sort of had the big first sort of collapse of Arctic sea ice, and it started to sort of build up a new type of momentum and interest, I think, in the Arctic, which in many ways have just continued on its journey, I think. So what is the upside of this increased awareness and interest in the Arctic? And if we can just briefly comment on that question, and we'll run through the list as a sort of way of ending this webinar. Tor, you go first.
This was the one you didn't prepare us for. What I think, I'm not sure if the 2007 was particularly important for where we are today, but it was a wake-up call. But what is really reassuring now is that you see that the advice or the insistence or the reality on the ground happening outside, like the net zero report from IEA, more and more resonance both with how the public understand things and how the politicians slowly seem to act, and even being led by major businesses and so on. And the Arctic is maybe or maybe not a part of this. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than I used to be.
Here, Mette?
Yes, I have become a bit more optimistic by the discussions today, actually. I thought it was very interesting to hear how the policy development and agreements have come in place after, perturbations to the system, and then when you put stress on the policy system, and then what the Arctic states have done is to collaborate and come up with new agreements. And that is also what I hear from my colleagues in the US with the big changes that has occurred with the heat wave that I was mentioning initially, that these big perturbations to the systems and all the changes have really opened up for stronger science management and decision maker collaborations and communications. And that's so it's kind of a parallel to what is happening on the policy side, and that makes me really optimistic. Well, not really optimistic, but more optimistic.
You said it, really optimistic. We have it on record. Andreas?
Yes, I'm very optimistic. I think just the political changes that we've seen in the Arctic over the last couple of decades are turning the Arctic into a regular region, a regular part of the world. I don't see the Arctic as being kind of different or being exposed to something that is worse than other parts of the world. But if the Arctic is exceptional in any way, I think that the community that the Arctic states have built amongst the researchers, the different Arctic conferences in Norway or Iceland or the US, the fact that you have the Arctic Council that was developed as a talking shop that no one really cared much about, and now suddenly has a lot of impact or policy shaping mechanism at least. I think all these structures that Elana also talked about, I think they actually were put in place or are being developed before things spiral too bad out of hand. So I think we're on the right path, but we need to keep talking about it. So good job for organizing a seminar.
Thank you. 3 out of 4. Do we have 4 out of 4, Elana?
I'm also, there are many optimistic points I think to point to it, just specifically to the question of non-Arctic state or not kind of a global interest in the Arctic. I guess I would hope to see that caring about the Arctic would result in significant actions to mitigate climate change at the national level, which I think is something we need to see broadly and globally. Specifically for the Arctic, I think it would be great to see some global action on problems, for example, of black carbon, which has been on and off the Arctic Council agenda. And then I think the other positive thing about, or additional positive thing about kind of the broader global interest is that it certainly holds Arctic states to a certain level of account, that most of the Arctic states do not like the idea of some kind of global governance setup or a broader regime for the Arctic. They've argued that they can govern the Arctic effectively using the law of the sea and their own tendencies towards cooperation in Arctic governance. So I also think the attention of the rest of the world on these Arctic questions is a good way of keeping momentum behind realizing this stated political vision that the Arctic states will work to manage successfully Arctic governance questions.
Perfect. So this would be the point in our webinar where you would get a round of applause from all the audience. So you have to imagine that in your head. And then, I just want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us today. And to the audience for participating in this Björknes Center webinar. In case I forgot, my name is Øyvind Påske. I'm with the Björknes Center of Climate Research and Climate Futures. We enjoyed very much this webinar. Thank you very much and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.